Greetings, everyone. My name is Peter Young. I'm a member of the Committee 100 and on the board, and it's my privilege also to be the chairman of the Asian American Career Ceilings Initiative, which we started 5 years ago and didn't expect it would be as popular as it is. But this is actually technically the 49th event that we've done in the last 5 years. And the reason why it was started was very straightforward, which is we all know that Asian Americans have no trouble getting into uh, great schools and getting entry jobs in most industries. But as they progress up the ladder, it becomes tougher and tougher. And Asian Americans in general find it very difficult to get from the mid ranks up to the very top. And this is a problem, and there are a lot of different reasons why this is true. But over the last couple of years, we've had researchers, we've had various people from the industry, so forth, and from leading headhunting firms, really help educate the audience as to what drives this, why, what can you do about it. And we've spent a lot of time also on solutions with summits where we get the people who are running nonprofits focused on this issue together to brainstorm and come up with ideas and implement them. So it's my great pleasure today to present a panel on the obstacles and opportunities in media and entertainment. And now there were three panelists, but just to tell you how active and unpredictable life in media and entertainment is, Richard Louie, who is an anchor for MSNBC, he got called away to cover this major event in Singapore. So he is on a plane apparently on his way to Singapore, and he apologized to me yesterday that he couldn't he couldn't be part of this panel. But I know that both Albert and Nicole will make up for the fact that he's not on, because there's certainly a whole host of different categories of media and entertainment that we're going to try to cover today, because it's a very important industry in this society. I just want to give a brief introduction of our two panelists, alphabetically in order of their, well, actually, it's alphabetical whether it's first name or last name, right, Albert? Right? Yeah, so you had the problem, and if you were Peter Young, most of the time they go by last name, and I was always the last person. Well, Albert Cheng has a very important role in entertainment. He is vice president and the U.S. and global head of Prime Video. I explained to Albert that members of my family are addicted to his streaming service, and he has had an incredible career across various parts of the entertainment industry. I won't read through his bio since it was on the, it's on the invitation, but really has pretty extensive experience across many companies, including the Disney, Walt Disney Company, et cetera. And his teams have won many Emmy Awards. And so he has had really an exceptional career. With Nicole, she is a reporter in the Washington Post's investigative unit, and she was co-host of Broken Doors, an investigative podcast that won the Robert F. Kennedy Journalist Award for Radio, and a finalist for audio reporting in the Pulitzer Prize. She has a long history as well in her industry, and she has both the joy and the curse of doing investigative reporting. So she doesn't write articles every day about what happened today, but she does some very deep investigative reporting. And we all know that the Washington Post is really exceptional in this category. They're really fantastic, and Nicole is an important member of the team that has investigated some very, very important issues for this society. So with that, I can't tell you how pleased I am to have the two of them as panelists. And just so you know, this is a 1 hour event, but we will try to leave time at the end for questions. And the way questions are asked is there's a Q&A chat box. Don't use the general chat box. use the Q&A chat box and just type in your questions. Nicole, Albert, and I will be able to see those questions, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. This is being recorded, so if you want to binge watch it over and over again, in a few days, it'll be available on the Committee of 100 website. I know Albert and Nicole will share it with their broad family members, and that'll get the ratings up really high, right? So with that, what I like to, I'm gonna reverse the order, and I'm gonna ask each of you to take a few minutes and really give us a little bit of your personal and career history and what you do today. I'm particularly interested in, where were you born? Where did you grow up? And then how did you end up, pursuing the career that you're in today? So Nicole, do you want to start out?
Sure. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I can start at the very beginning. I grew up in the Bay Area, and I think in that way, I do have a different relationship to kind of being Asian American and how that has played out in my career in the sense that where I grew up, and I'm sure Albert and Peter know this being from Hawaii, there were just a lot of Asians around. It was very normal for me to see Asian Americans as teachers, as people in positions of authority, not nearly as enough, but still I saw them, didn't think it was odd. And actually, my first journalism internship was at a magazine called Filipinas Magazine, which was based out of South San Francisco. And it just came naturally to me to tell our stories, to tell AAPI stories and feel like they were important, even though, we didn't necessarily see them on the silver screen as much. I knew that that was something that I thought would be important for me. And so, kind of building off of that, I knew I wanted to tell those kinds of stories when I went into journalism. I went to Brown and then graduated and went to the Oregonian in Portland, Oregon, and actually entering the journalism industry is when I saw these spaces where there weren't so many AAPIs in positions of leadership, where I was one of the only Asians in the room. And that's when I really got kind of interested in telling our stories even more because I thought this is so normal for me growing up. Why isn't it normal for people all over the country to see people like us in positions of authority? And from the Oregonian, every step that I took within my journalism career, I just wanted to start doing stories with a lot of impact. I went to the Boston Globe so that I could join. I eventually wanted to join their spotlight team. That was one of my big dreams, and I was eventually able to do that, and eventually made it to the Washington Post to join the investigative team. And so that's kind of a pretty standard path that I think a lot of journalists before me had gone through, but that doesn't necessarily, really look the same way now if you think about new media and what kind of organizations exist. But for me, it was a pretty standard path where I did feel like I had organizations like the Asian American Journalists Association, of which I'm the president, there to support me. And I was able to have these kinds of organizations say, we believe in you, we think you can do this kind of work, and feel like I wasn't the only one in the room.
Yeah.
And so that's been really important for me in my career.
Yeah, and I mean that's very, very helpful. And also later it'll be very interesting just to ask you what the perspective is from the Asian American, Society of Journalists, because they have a very important role, but also in your role as president, you're exposed to how all of your members are experiencing this issue about career ceilings, right? So that'll be helpful, not just your own personal perspective. So Albert, tell me about your career. We know you grew up in Hawaii like I did. So, but did you overcome that handicap eventually?
Well, I mean, really, like Nicole, I think I spent all of my childhood in Hawaii, and then and then just to think that I was going to get a little more of a diverse experience, I spent my undergrad at MIT. So I was surrounded by Asians, and so the idea of actually having any sense of or any sort of awareness of my identity really didn't happen until actually after I graduated school and started working in corporate America. And for me, I have probably what you would call a fairly maybe not a, no, maybe a traditional sort of career path in terms of my parents' eyes. I studied to be engineer. There was basically three kind of career options that my parents kind of held in the approved list, which is doctor, lawyer, engineering. And so I was an engineer by training. I went to MIT, but very quickly I knew that that is not what I wanted to do. So I wound up doing everything I could to figure out how to actually move into media and entertainment, which is not an approved industry.
Your parents were
And
wild about that, right?
if anything, I think they were probably more worried that I was about to step into an area that one, they didn't have any expertise around, right? And they actually didn't know what kind of jobs do you do in this industry. And how much do you get paid, and all the things that would come around with the requirements of what is deemed a successful kid when they grew up. So I spent a lot of time actually trying to make a career transition at the same time, I would say struggling with sort of parental expectations, both of which colliding and sort of grinding through this to the point where I think a lot of times earlier in my career, I think my parents were probably a little bit worried about did I make the right choice, and ultimately they don't say that anymore. I think they feel okay about what I'm doing.
But
Um,
it took a while.
it took a while. I still think they, even to this day, they don't quite exactly know what I do, and I think I think they're okay with my career choices. But it's one of those things where you kind of have to work against a lot of what they thought was the path that what I should have taken, and I had to do a lot of learning myself through that whole process. Not only kind of going up through corporate America, which was one whole other challenge, but also media entertainment, which also this business.
Yeah, that's right. Well, by the way, you share one thing in common, but you made the right decision. My parents wanted me to go to MIT, and they said, "Oh, well, we've decided that you should go to MIT." And I said, "Well, I can't apply to just one school." They said, "Oh, okay. Well, you can apply to Harvard and Yale." I said, "Which one is the safety school?"
Oh my gosh.
The end result is I did get into MIT, but I made them furious because I ended up going to Yale, and they didn't talk to me for 2 years. And they still, like you, they have no idea what I do, you know.
Yeah.
They can't figure out what somebody who's in investment banking does, but uh, uh, I don't think they ever figured it out, right? So tell me now, one of the challenges of these panels is that, almost every industry is pretty diverse, right? And so, you pick a profession, you get a couple of panelists that are mainstream, but you inevitably are maybe covering 20% of that industry. Can you comment a little bit? I mean, this issue of career ceilings problem obviously is a problem across the board in many, many segments of media and entertainment. But maybe you can step back with a big picture and say, what are the key segments that this audience should be aware of? And which ones are the more problematic in terms of career ceilings, obstacles versus, less so? And so think a little bit back, big picture above just your own industry, and just comment. Nicole, any comments? Because in journalism, there's so many different parts of journalism, right? I mean, just unbelievable, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say broadly in all parts of the industry, there just aren't as many Asian American journalists as there should be. We do studies with AAJA, and shout out to Paul Chung of the Committee of 100, who is a former AAJA president, I know he's watching now.
Yeah.
But we do studies, for example, with broadcast journalism and trying to see which which areas have an anchor that's API, and the areas with the biggest API populations don't necessarily have the representation on screen that they should. So even though there are APIs, throughout the industry, we just see broadly that there aren't as many in the pipeline really representing the population of the US. I mean, newsrooms broadly don't represent how diverse the US is at all. And then when you get to positions of leadership, uh, it's obviously even harder to find APIs in position of leadership. And I think you see that both in print journalism or digital journalism, but also within broadcast journalism. And sometimes we do see progress. We'll sometimes see an editor in chief in charge of a newsroom that is an API person, but there's not nearly enough. And then there are also times when there are certain sectors that just do see more of a ceiling. I mean, if you look um, at the average cable news channel or news network, I'm sure Richard would have said this, but you see way more Asian American women on TV as broadcasters than you do see Asian American men. And those are just things that are still very stark that you see throughout the industry.
Yeah. Well, you did a really good imitation of Richard Louis, by the way.
Yeah, we get
So
we get mixed up all the
yeah,
time.
I
People,
know, absolutely, and I know you know each other quite well. Now, one question though is, do you sense that two of the big differences are either the written form of journalism and then the broadcast. You've already commented that Asian men don't do so well in the in broadcast journalism. Do you see any significant differences in the written journalism and broadcast journalism in terms of this career ceiling issue?
I think on air you do see. I think it's easier to see kind of the ceilings that people hit.
Hmm.
Um, because it really is about representation in a lot of ways. There are only so many anchor jobs, there are only so many on-air jobs, and it becomes very, very fierce competition. And it really becomes quite stark when you're thinking about just major networks and who's on air at all times. And so, it very much is a long way to go when it comes to broadcast. But when I look at, major outlets like the Post or the New York Times or the Journal, none of us are where we should be in terms of diversity. There's
Right.
obviously been a lot of progress that's been made, but in areas like investigative journalism, when I'm asked, who's another API woman or who's another API man that I can recommend for a job, those names are harder to find because we don't necessarily have that pipeline where people are being encouraged to go into investigative journalism as Asian American men and women.
Yeah, no, that's right. Albert, your area is equally diverse, in terms of different categories and so forth, and probably similarly, there's some very different career ceiling issues and experiences. Can you comment on
Yeah,
the media entertainment?
sure. I would break down the types of jobs or careers in two categories. One is business, if you're in a business sort of job function, or you're a creative.
Mhm.
And on the business side, I would say, that it's the same issues anywhere in corporate America. Very few Asian Americans in senior level positions. They tap out, if you look at it, they tap out probably around VP. It's very hard to get SVP, EVP, president roles. You just see it's very similar in general. You
Mhm.
don't see um, a lot of Asian Americans in leadership positions that actually are responsible for a P&L or responsible for some really key strategic decisions or leading a large organization. Most of the Asian Americans you see are actually founding their own companies or for the most part there are very few or then building their own companies for the most part. On the creative side, similar. I think there are challenges both from a creative job within a major studio or network.
Mhm.
It's similar issues of like leadership challenges, and then on the talent side, meaning in front of or people in that side, it's again similar issues. I think we've made a lot more progress in front of the camera in now versus when I started the industry.
Yeah.
Uh, it's except that we tend to make the same choices. I mean, I think like Michelle Yeoh has probably gotten every single job possible. And every time I kind of say, well, Michelle's awesome, but we've got like 10 others that you could probably choose from. And so I think that the hard part about the creative side is, both in front of and behind the camera, is that your career, the way Hollywood works, it's a very cottage apprenticeship industry. And
Mhm.
so people wind up starting from the bottom, like in the mailroom, working as assistant, and there aren't that many Asians in
Yeah,
general. So the critical mass of Asians to bring people up through the ranks is very little, because there's not enough people. And I think there are a lot of organizations, of one of which I'm a part of, which is CAPE, and there's a whole bunch of others in terms of trying to build networks, bring people who are coming in the industry up, provide opportunities. It's sort of like you just want to look after people who are just entering the business, because many cases that's how people get their next job, right? And so that in itself, just being on the creative side, there's headwinds being able to do that. Um, More progress has been made, and there are a lot of both in terms of just the global media and entertainment environment has opened up, a little bit more of a less of a dismissal of Asian representation. But I will still say that it is not easy and it's hard, and sometimes you do need people in positions to be able to call out things that are missed. So, and we just don't have enough of them.
yeah.
So, yeah, so those are the two areas that there's similar issues, and uh, you know, it can be very frustrating in terms of not being able to see that much
Yeah.
work.
One comment is there's a different series that I had at the Committee 100, which is called Conversations, Recollections, Pioneers, and Heroes. And what we do is we interview people who really contribute to this country in different areas. So we did an interview of Janet Yang, who
Mhm.
Joy Luck Club and Crazy Rich Asian Americans, and she was for 3 years the head of the Screen Actors, so forth. And she had a very interesting perspective on it, and she said it's in the management. She said very similar things that you said, Albert, which is that on the management ranks, it's tough. And more recently, there have been more breakthroughs in terms of people in movies and TV shows and so forth, but they're not all BD Wongs and David Henry Wongs and people like that. And there's still a gap. The other comment people make is, in general, across all of these events we've had with researchers, so forth, mentorship is stated as one of the most important aspects to success. And you've got a catch 22, which is if you don't have Asian Americans, you don't have Asian Americans who can then mentor Asian Americans. And it's natural that people tend to mentor people who more look like them. So it's one of these terrible catch 22s. The other thing I want to mention, Albert, is you talked about the fact that, yeah, the guys in your industry who are the heads are the ones who started it. Ironically, it's almost identical in the high tech industry. Everybody perceives high tech as, oh, there must be lots of Asians. It's just there are a lot of Asians in the middle ranks. But if you look and you say, well, the Jensen Huangs and and the Eric, founders of Zoom, or they all started those companies, right?
Right.
And Morris Cheng, who was a Committee 100 member, left Intel because they didn't promote him, and he started Taiwan Semiconductor, which is now the largest semiconductor company in the world. They wish they could have reversed that decision, right? So there's similarities, Albert, what you say in other industries as well. But this mentorship thing is definitely a problem, right? And if you're in a position of seniority, you got to do your best to try to mentor, to try to offset the problem of numbers, right?
Yep.
Now, you talk about the barriers, so well, maybe let's talk about what they are, right? In other words, if you look, Albert, on the corporate side and Nicole on the journalistic side, what would be your list of the sort of the 3 to 5 things that you can, vocalize that are the barriers that Asian Americans face? Nicole, you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I think we named a lot of them. Just right now, I think that there's this, the people who are in positions to hire for a lot of things, they do go to certain places, they recognize certain schools, they have different networks. And if those are not diverse networks or ones that include a lot of Asian Americans, then some of those people don't get in the industry and they don't get hired and they don't, rise the ranks. And that really just affects everybody. I mean, when you think about in the broadcast journalism side, um, if there isn't an Asian American news director, for example, or a person of color in that news director job, then maybe they don't know other anchors that they can hire who aren't just, white people that they've known in their network. So I think mentorship and just like different networks are big barriers. And I think, there have been tons of studies about this. It's the way that people perceive different races. I think that, when people choose who they think should be leaders, there are stereotypes that that Asian American Pacific Islanders have to reckon with, whether they're the ones who are going to be seen as natural leaders. And, those are obviously things that are not our fault when we get into these newsrooms, but it is something that we have to contend with. Like, who stands out as the natural leader or somebody who would actually be good for some of these higher positions?
Yeah, that's right. Albert, your perspective?
Yeah, I think the way I look at it is we work we work in a country that has a predominant culture, and that is driven by Western values. And there are certain things in leadership that Western values look for that actually, in my view, sometimes come into contention with Eastern Confucianism, in which many Asians grow up with in terms of how they look at, the interaction hierarchy, how they interact with, how they think about societal structures, leading and being in general, how they work within a group. And it's something that I've always seen, which is, I've had to fight against it. I was not even aware of like how my own cultural upbringing was preventing myself from being a leader in a Western cultural driven, country. And sometimes you even see differences, right? If you look at South Asians versus East Asians, which are very different in terms of culture,
Yes,
South
absolutely.
Asians are far more successful, I think, in key leadership positions because they don't have what I would call the baggage of Confucianism that often becomes a barrier to succeeding in the Western world. Like that's, so if you put an Asian person in a corporate world where it's driven by Confucianism, it's probably a little bit different. But the fact is, we work in a very, Western culture. Individualism is valued, becoming, more of the louder voice in the room. Sometimes the louder voice to the extent that sometimes it's not even backed up by real data or experience. That sometimes even wins, which can be very frustrating to someone who is more used to keeping their head down, doing the work, understanding the details, very diligent in delivering high quality work, which oftentimes in Western culture or management culture is like, oh, they're great. They're great number twos.
Yeah, right.
They're great operating people that I can count on, but I'm the leader, I'm the visionary, and I can use that Asian guy
Yeah,
or what, right? And
yeah,
so the challenge is how do you break through that? And it's hard. And and I think that's one of the big, inherently we live in a culture that there is inherent biases in general. So you have that working against as a headwind. And then on top of that, if you have cultural things in which I was raised, don't speak up, your dad and mom are always right, even though they're probably wrong. I literally, that was my parents. My parents would say, even though we're wrong, you have to say we're right. I mean, that's
Are they, by the way, Albert, are they watching this now?
well, they know it because it doesn't matter. They can watch it. But and I used to find that I was like, okay, but that's part of, it's the filial piety. It's a very Confucianist, Confucian driven value system. And that's how I grew up. And so put into a corporate environment, part of my challenge is how do I get into a conversation? Do I wait to be
Yeah,
called?
yeah, yeah,
Do
yeah,
I jump in? And I could see my colleagues jumping in and they'd be contributing and I would have a thought.
yeah,
That thought winds up becoming irrelevant by the time that I'm ready to jump into conversation, right? And it's always that respecting, when do I go? Do I go? Do I talk over my boss? And I think that's the thing that sort of stopped me. And the reality was is I didn't know that early in my career until I had some really good sponsors and
yeah.
mentors and people who call it out, like Jane Hyun. Do you know Jane, who wrote Breaking the Bamboo Ceiling?
Oh,
Just
yeah, 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 yeah.
she was the first person who literally met me and said, Albert, you should read my book. This was early in my career, and I was unaware, and I started reading it. It made a lot of sense, and I spent a 10-year journey of trying to get past the what I had to unlearn to be in corporate America, and then coupled that with sponsors who, surprisingly, none of my sponsors who sponsored me early in my career were Asian at all. They were
Right,
all,
right. Yeah,
Caucasian
yeah.
bosses that I had, and that helped me grow. So, it's that so I definitely think there's I mean, when you look at sort of the commonalities, and when I meet other Asians that are in my company, and I can see that tentativeness, they don't like speaking up, they don't like rocking the boat. I will also call out and say, here's where you're going to have to feel comfortable, and it's going to be very uncomfortable. And sometimes you may think, well, I may be doing something that might get me fired. It's like, well, maybe, but have you tried? And
Yeah,
sometimes you're actually rewarded for that,
yeah. No, it's very interesting what you point out, and your point about South Asians is absolutely correct. In fact, we've had some prominent researchers from Columbia University and MIT, MIT, your alma mater, who did studies that not only looked at Asian American careers, but then looked at the difference between different Asian ethnicities. And the data really shows that South Asians and Indian Americans do far better. You look at it, look at CEOs of some of these major companies, and not just in technology. There's a very large number of Indian Americans, and I think your summary of the reason why, was one of the things that was cited, because it's clearly not because they look Caucasian. It's not clearly because they never have an accent. It's none of those things are true. So it's something else. I mean, I guess one obvious question though for both of you is part of what held you back. And by the way, the same thing happened to me. I have two sisters. We had to actively rebel against our parents, and literally rebel against them. I mean, my parents, I wanted to run for student body officer, and my parents said no. So I ran secretly when they were away they were both academics. They went to an academic conference, came back, and I had won, and it was a fait accompli. But or sports, the same thing. I was in varsity sports, but we really had to rebel. Do you think that's changing though, because as each generation goes by, because you know, my parents and Albert, I know your parents were from a certain generation. Do you think that's going to change, and will that quote handicap gradually, diminish over time? What do you think, Nicole? I don't know if you had the same kind of parents that Albert and I have. I hope not.
I mean, I've referred to them as tiger parents light, where you're expected to get good grades, but we're not going to say what you should be, but it should be something good. And so even the fact that they let me go into journalism, I think shows that they were a little more permissive than other families would be,
Yeah,
because, in a traditional immigrant family, um, like Albert was saying earlier, they're very obvious modes of success,
yeah,
doctor, lawyer, engineer. Like that is just what everybody knows, especially from an East Asian, even Southeast Asian perspective. But I mean, I think it is very different. I mean, even just, each generation, I think, gets a little louder. And I think that they also appreciate their identity a lot more. I think you've even seen this with, if I were comparing to like how if Richard were talking about how he felt about being an Asian American on air, when he first started versus now, I think it'd be very different. I mean, when you think about things like Stop AAPI Hate, which gave rise to a lot of opportunities for people in Albert's industry in terms of being on screen, when there was this idea that we did want to have more diverse representation in movies and TV, but also in the media. And so I think those generations are more used to those kinds of stories and are more used to being proud of that, as opposed to, my parents' generation. They immigrated from the Philippines, and a lot of it was about assimilation. And so they were coming from a generation where they just felt very different about their identity and they didn't necessarily feel like it was some sort of strength. And now I tell, like the other day, I was talking to a group about their careers and I was like, you know, my identity to me is like a superpower rather than a handicap, which if you had asked Asian Americans 40 years ago when they started AJA, it definitely felt like a handicap to them because there was outright racism. And then there was this idea that if you wrote about Asian stories, suddenly all you want to cover is Chinatown or, you know, the
And then you
Filipino
get
stories. Yeah,
you get pigeonholed, right? And then it would be hard to,
right.
right?
And
Yeah.
then you're contending with people with an industry that didn't necessarily value those stories, so you're not getting as much play on the newspaper, or maybe you're not on the front page as much. But now I think people do care a lot about race, and even though it can be very divisive,
Yeah.
you know, there is this idea that these generations are very content to talk about race and how proud they are.
Yeah.
But then also I think it's also something about socioeconomic status. I think the industries that we've chosen, I think Albert talked about it before, like it is very difficult to go into an industry like journalism if you don't have the kind of support that would allow you to be in a lower level position, making a smaller amount of money for several years before you get kind of these big breaks. And as you know, journalism does become more uncertain and those jobs do disappear, I do think it does become more difficult for young people to say, oh, that sounds great. I'd love to go into that. I mean, there was recently a Mother Jones article about how so few people from like the Harvard graduating class were going to media because they were getting lured by, you know, consulting jobs, these other jobs that had a much easier, like a much more certain way paths to prosperity. And I think that's something that's also generations do have to contend with, that
Yeah.
these kind of creative industries might not be lucrative on the front end. And that does really affect who stays in it as long to become part of the top of a newsroom or a company.
But a lot of industries are going to be rearranged. We'll talk later about things like AI, but a lot of industries are going to be rearranged. So, you know, consulting may become less popular just because it's more vulnerable to AI and so forth. So, Albert, any comment about the generational differences, whether it's
Yeah.
getting better or whatever, right?
I think it's going to get better. I think as each generation moves farther away from the influence and Confucianism
Mhm.
in it, I think you're already starting seeing it. Like, you know, when I first entered the entertainment industry, there weren't a whole lot of people. I mean, now now there's a lot more Asian Americans in the business, both in front of and behind the camera.
Yeah,
And you also have sort of over the last, couple of years during even, Stop Asian Hate, of a strong degree of allyship with other groups that I think has proven in terms of younger generations to be very powerful sort of propel, energy to propel like a community to move forward, right? Because you have not only your own voice, but you have Black Americans who are standing next to you thinking the same thing with Latinos, and it just feels like I think the advancement of the Asian voice would not have been able to be accomplished without sort of allyship across the board, and I think especially during that really volatile time, and it just I think it gave sort of uh, it lended to itself validation that you can speak up,
yeah,
to a generation, because before it was like, no, 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 don't, our parents would say, do not step into that ring. Like my parents would basically, please do not stick out there because we don't want, so and so coming after you.
yeah.
But I think, in nowadays it's like, no, you got to speak up. And I think there's more of a, acceptance and allowance, even an encouragement of that with younger generations.
Now, I don't know whether either of you has any kids or not. It's not on your bio, whatever. But if you do, I'd like you to comment whether you are raising your kids differently than you were. I can comment from my side, and that is my wife and I went the absolute opposite of our parent, my parents. In other words, we just we told our son, we have one son, oh, we have no opinion about what school college you go to.
Oh,
And
wow.
none at all. And I remember one time he went to a school where you're assigned a counselor, right? And his counselor had like 40 students assigned to her. And once a year, the parents get to join the session. And the counselor said, "Oh, to our son, do you have your parents express a preference as to where you should go to college?" And he said, "No, but I can feel it." And she said, "Look, I'm responsible for 40 kids. You're the only one where the parents have not explicitly indicated their preference." And then he fell in love with the profession, by the way, which is the application of technology to entertainment, Albert. So he does all Victoria's Secret Fashion Week, Virgin Cruise Lines. By the way, he's involved with the recent show that just opened, which is Masquerade, the Phantom of the Opera
Mhm.
immersive experience. And he's super technical. He has his own company, and he's worked on that. It's like the last thing that my wife and I would want him to go in, but we didn't say a word. And we said, if that's what you love, and if you think you're good at it, we'll let you go and do it. And he's been appreciative, but it's an exact opposite of what my parents would have done. Do either of you have kids, and are you telling them, oh, you should go to MIT, Albert?
I don't have kids, so I never had the pleasure of having to pass down what my parents did. But what I have seen, I have relatives and cousins who I've seen where their parents were very insistent that they do a certain profession,
Yeah,
and the sad part about it is that they weren't good at it.
Oh,
yeah, yeah,
no.
So they were forced to, right? And so I'm like, but I don't think that sets up your kid for success if you didn't get great, if you have to be an engineer, but you got C's and barely passed. It's like,
yeah.
I don't think that really helps your child become successful in a profession that you're just not great at. And I know that they will probably had desires of doing something else. And so sometimes I think the more you love what you want to do, the better you're going to be at it because you put in the hours and you're going to work your ass off, as opposed to be forcing into a profession where you just don't love, just to set an expectation of your parents. And I've seen too many of them. I have a lot of, you know, familial data points where you just wish that they had chosen the path they wanted to choose because they would have been better off.
Yeah, no, that's right. Nicole, I know you have 45 kids, right? And they're
Yeah,
and
I have. No,
and they're
I don't
they're
have
all
kids
going and they're all going
either.
to MIT where Albert went, right?
Yeah. I don't have kids either. I don't know what that says about our industries and being workaholics. I'm not sure. But yeah, I mean, I would also agree with the idea that you do more for something that you're passionate for. I've seen people who have been successful in business and then, 15, 20 years in, and I think it really starts to weigh on you in a way that it might not if every day you really care about what you're doing every single day. And I think I see friends who are getting out of certain industries because they just don't have that passion. And I think um, caring a lot about what you do is kind of the recipe for success.
Yeah, yeah. That's interesting. Now, one comment I want to make is thinking about each of your industries. I mean, I think pretty much every industry goes through change, right? Everyone, I'm in investment banking, it's going through change. You go through technology, going through change. And I think the change can be everything. The most prominent news item is AI, the impact of AI, which is having an impact on both of your industries, right? So forth. But there are a lot of other things too, consolidation, so forth. Streaming video didn't exist, 20 years ago, and so forth. So, what do you see in the industries that you're most familiar with? What are the big picture changes that you think this audience should know about, but also that would affect this whole issue about Asian Americans succeeding? Because there could be a change that's neutral with regard to the career ceilings issue, but there are others that could just make it a lot more difficult, right? Any comment about that?
Nicole, you want to go?
Oh, I mean, I think that, AI and consolidation, it does affect both of our industries in a very, very big way. The technologies, I mean, it's almost too obvious to say the internet has really dealt like such a blow in some ways to the media industry, because once everything became free on the internet, it became very difficult to sustain the same kinds of profits that news outlets used to have, even, and broadcast networks used to have. But I think you always will need people creating the news, reporting the news. There's obviously been a lot of hand wringing over AI. There are obviously very real issues with that and how it's going to play out. But I think that the kind of work that I do and that a lot of my colleagues do can't be replaced. The kind of critical thinking that we put into the reporting and talking to people. I mean, journalism is very much going out and talking to people and trying to get them to give you answers they're not supposed to talk to you about, to create relationships. And I think, you know, we're a ways off when that will make us, when AI would make all of those, all of that relationship building, all of that creativity absolutely obsolete. I think you already see that if you're doing something that's a little more rote, that's something that's, you know, coverage that doesn't take that much critical thinking, that is going to be difficult to sustain. But the things that really stick with people, and we see this in metrics, are the things that we put a lot of time into. It's the kind of writing that makes you go to the end. It's the kind of videos that really catch people and are engaging to the end. So I think, you know, even though AI is going to change things dramatically, and, you know, there will be some jobs that won't exist anymore, the kind of work that you probably want to do, I think, will still exist. The kind of work that really grabs people and makes people feel something, that's going to be, that's going to always exist. And people are going to be the creative driving forces behind that, not necessarily ChatGPT.
Yeah. You know, Albert, your industry's gone through massive change, you know,
Yeah.
I mean, I could go on for half an hour and list the changes, a lot of it driven by technology that have, you know, that have changed. You know, can you comment a little about what changes that you think are relevant to people who are Asian Americans thinking about their careers, right?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I think what Nicole said, actually, I would just echo and add to plus one to everything she said on, you know, the impact of AI, what people should be doing to stay ahead of it. And it doesn't matter if you're Asian American or you're not. I think what's really important for us as a community and wanting to be future leaders is to really dig deep and learn it. Um, and It's so funny because you introduced me as the head of Prime Video. That was actually my old job last week.
You knew
This
that.
week, yeah, well, this week I'm actually the head of AI Studios at Amazon MGM Studios for a very specific reason, and is because I actually do think AI is the future of how entertainment will be created, and I wanted to get a, you know, this is very much in my DNA,
Yeah,
Peter.
yeah,
So I did the streaming thing 20 years ago, and like
yeah,
I actually do think AI is that next wave of technology transformation.
yeah, yeah,
But what's really important is like there's a lot of hype around AI, and I think a lot of people in our town is just worried about, like, you know, the impact of jobs. But my point of view is the reality is that AI is going to up the game. Just what Nicole said. It's just going to make like the person who's going to spend 10,000 hours on making that awesome AI enabled film to be the thing that actually people care about. Because what AI has really done is it's allowed sort of the average person or the average like Albert Cheng who wants to post a funny little video to make a really cool video, but that's not going to really be a business model. I
yeah,
mean, and you'll see a lot of it, right, on social media, a lot of AI, everyone's all freaking out about like, oh, we won't have no actors. And the reality is that there's something about, you know, content and quality that is basically driven by people who spend a lot of time crafting it to perfection.
yeah,
And AI can help them actually get there faster if they put in the time. I don't think the Albert Cheng video that makes, you know, puts him on the top of a mountaintop and skydives is going to do anything. I mean, there's going to be a lot of that, what I call AI slop, that's going to be
yeah,
plentiful. But the average consumer is going to pretty recognize it. You know, the level of that kind of content will sort of be raised, and people are going to go, yeah, it's fine, it's AI, whatever. But the one thing that someone's going to, you know, drive someone to watch a movie that was done by AI is that storytelling, the person who's thought through every single scene, and knows how to work with AI. So you know, for, as Nicole said, for those who want a job to come in and do things that are rote, I think there are risks there if that is how you want to, you know, make a living. If you are a creator and a desire to make your own movie and you've been storyboarding, you know, 10 years in your life working on a major movie and you don't know when you have your chance directing or making your next animated film like K-pop Demon Hunters this summer, you can actually use AI and make it yourself.
Yeah.
So like you know, I definitely, and part of my desire to jump right into AI now, and I'm lucky enough to be able to do that at Amazon, is I do think there will be a consolidation of major media companies
Yes.
and be fewer of them, taking less risks. And unless we figure out how to drive the costs of content down, there will be a dearth of innovation. But what AI has done and will do is it'll open up a whole new opportunity for what I would consider like the age of the independent content producer creator to leverage AI to create the movie that would not be picked up by a studio.
Yeah.
Because you know, streaming has democratized
Right.
distribution, and AI is going to democratize content creation at a cinematic level.
Yeah.
So, you know, you know, who knows? Like, you know, years from now, I'll be like Albert Cheng's company. I'm going to go off and I'm going to recruit the best artists, Asian artists, and we're going to make, you know, K-pop Demon Hunters 5. But you know, it's that kind of idea where I think the future will allow more content creators to enter the market. And there'll be more independent voices. So I do, maybe I'm an optimist in general. I do feel like, you know, voices will be heard, and technology will drive it. But it really is up to everyone to embrace it and learn it. I'm learning every day. Part of the fun of this job is like I'm meeting with a lot of other AI studios, people who've been doing it for the last couple of years, you know, testing video models. I've been blown away by Sora 2 yesterday. I mean, these are things that are, I think people really should, you know, dig in and learn it because it's going to be really important if, especially early in your career. If like you are starting out, like learn it now. And if you're in the middle of your career, yes, you definitely have to learn it now because otherwise you'll be out of a job.
Yeah.
You know, I'm at the towards the end of my career, so I'm just having fun. So, you know, this is what I recommend people to do.
Yeah, that's very interesting because, and actually, I think it's good advice because AI is going to affect pretty much every industry, that I can think of. And by the way, we're generally not in the business of breaking news, but I just want the audience to know that we broke the story that Albert has changed his job, right? You know, you're the first to know, and you know through the Committee 100 Asian American Career Ceilings. So mark that down as one of our accomplishments. But I think, Albert, you're right. And, both of you are right about the impact. And there are a lot of changes happening. AI happens to be one, but a major one. And I will tell you, I had a very interesting experience recently related to AI, which is a very close friend of mine. Her son was getting married. And so we went to the wedding. He happens to be the head of all development at Anthropic, and there are like three major
Wow.
OpenAI, Anthropic.
Yep. Hmm.
And at the wedding, it was a small wedding, about 300 people, but 200 of the people were the people who worked for him. So if you spent the day and a half there at meals, pretty much you got overloaded with, but to hear what they had to say about what they thought AI and, was going to do and not do was just absolutely, Albert, you would have enjoyed that wedding if you had been there. But I think that's a very interesting point. So the lesson here is, as you think about your career, and if you're thinking about media and entertainment, make sure you understand, and I think what Albert's saying, make sure you get enough knowledge about AI to be able to maneuver around what skills you want to have and what impact it's going to have on different parts. But Albert, I would agree with you, which is innovation doesn't always drive out the veterans. And a good example is, now anybody can take pictures with their iPhone or whatever, right? Super high quality, so forth. But that hasn't killed the really good photographers who have the art, of photography and so forth. They're still doing fine because, the general public, they can tell the difference between first-rate creativity and artistics and something that like I take with my iPhone, right? Which clearly will never win any award, right? One question, I know, Nicole, you answered this, but it was interesting, pretty much when you talk to everyone about different industries, 90% of the time they say, if you compare Asian American women, Asian American men, Asian American women do not do as well as Asian men. You, for the first time, have pointed out one segment where the woman, news anchors, right, where Asian American. I mean, Albert, as you think about your profession, and Nicole, if you think beyond, the broadcast news, uh, are there some unique things about being an Asian American woman versus an Asian American man that are relevant to this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, the intersectionality of everything obviously matters. I think um, they're very different experiences, and you do have different mentors sometimes because of gender. I think you face different barriers being a woman, an Asian American woman about whether you would be a leader than you wouldn't necessarily face as a man. So I think those kinds of things are always relevant when it comes to kind of these ceilings.
Yeah. Albert?
Yeah, I think one would assume that being a man would put me in a more advantageous spot relative,
Mhm.
the female gender. But it's I don't I being Asian American probably has been more of a larger barrier more so than
Mhm. Mhm.
the gender aspect of it, and primarily for interestingly, I actually think it's again I could bring back to the Confucianism piece. A lot of those sort of inherent values wind up becoming my own barrier.
Yeah.
And so this what I try to tell folks is you actually have to recognize that, because if you don't recognize it, it's hard to break out of it because you're hardwired. If you're raised that way, you're hardwired, and to try to get past that is a very grinding and grueling task to kind of rewire your brain and feel comfortable in doing something that you were often told not to do, and it wasn't valued. And so I think that's been more of the issue, more than anything else than being male specifically.
I'll have one last question to ask you, and there were some questions, but they were, not necessarily specific to, they were very specific, and so may not be good for the broader audience. But I will say that having lived abroad and worked globally, for, I have clients all over the world. The interesting thing is you tend to always think about what the world looks like from your own point of view. But for example, Japan, ask any Western executive who was then sent over to Japan to work at a Japanese company. I know quite a few, and they'll talk about the same issues that we're talking about, just in the reverse.
Yep.
They couldn't figure out the decision process or how you formed friendships and mentors in the Japanese company, because the Japanese culture is quite different. And the same thing, boy, if you work for a Chinese company, it's a wild and different experience, and you'd face the same thing. So, this is more an issue of adaptation to your environment, as opposed to saying this is not necessarily a unique U.S. Problem. In fact, maybe the U.S. relative to certain countries might be easier for Asian Americans than if you were an Asian American and got sent off to pick a country, in the Middle East or something. Good luck trying to work for Saudi Arabian company. I mean, it's probably, even more challenging there. So we're towards the end of our hour, and I'd like each of you to really, in the closing part of this, really just to say, if if you have a couple things, advice to this audience, and this, you got to assume that the people in the audience are people who are trying to succeed. Not a whole hundred, they're not 100% Asian Americans, I will tell you, because some of them are not. Be any additional things you might want to say, and on top of what you said thus far, in terms of advice that you would give, right, to them in terms of being successful and trying to get to the top.
Um, I I mean, I think that it's kind of both things in terms of being an investigative reporter and just a reporter in general. There's both try to excel in a large swath of things, kind of be a generalist that can be thrown into a newsroom, but at the same time, and we talked about this earlier, follow your passions because that's really where your best work comes from. when you get up every day and want to be working on that thing, it's going to show, and people notice that. And those are really the stories that get the attention, because you become an expert and you create the best version of the story that you're going to do. So keep learning and follow your passion. I know that sounds corny, but it is very true.
Albert.
The one thing I would just add is if you were told to measure success a certain way, try to try to move away from whatever that metric is that your parents told you this is what success means. Or, don't think that you have to be, an EVP by 30 and therefore you're a success. To me, I've always looked at a career path more as a journey in which tests who I can be. Like every single job that I've had has always presented either a learning experience or a challenge to know that nope, that isn't me. I should do something else. And I think learning from that is so important, probably more important in terms of your future long-term career than meeting certain milestones. Because I think I've seen too many people try to feel like I'm not happy until I'm this by 30 and this by 35 and this by 40. Don't think of it that way. Like think long term, think what are you building in terms of your skill set, what you learn about what you're really good at, learn what you want to learn. Because ultimately, when you are true to yourself and really, it's really a study. This whole thing's about a study about you and the environment you work in. The better you understand yourself and how you can adapt or not adapt, these are all things that are inputs to kind of continually grow yourself. And that's ultimately what success is. And you will be successful if you learn. If you wind up pushing against something that's just not true, it's like no matter what you do, it just won't happen. And I mean, you just got to keep that in mind. And it really is a constant, working through. It's of who you are, what you want to do. Are you good at it? Don't talk or don't hear the voices in your head of what success means, because that's only going to interrupt, I think, your own development.
Yeah. In fact, I'm going to cite two famous people, neither of whom is Asian American, who were asked the question, what would be the one thing that someone should focus on in terms of what they should do? And that was Steve Jobs and Warren Buffett, who, I think they had decent careers, right? I think we would all agree. Both of them, when they were asked, uh, if you make a decision of what to do, what you want to focus on, they basically said, Nicole, what you said, which is follow your passion. But Warren Buffett went beyond. He said, look, if you're lucky and you're good at also what you're in love with, that's great. But if it's a choice between doing something that you have a passion for, but you're not necessarily great at it, or going after something that you're great at, but you have no passion, you're still better off if you go for what you have a passion. But Albert, I think you're a mind reader, because there's a totally different nonprofit thing that I've worked on for 14 years, which is advising young people on what careers and what does it really like to be a lawyer? What does it really like to be? And the number one thing we say before every event is we say, you can get perfect information about a profession, but if you don't have an honest assessment about yourself, what you like, what you don't like, do you have a long attention span? Are you willing to be indoors all the time, or do you want to be outdoors, or what? If you don't figure that out in an honest way about yourself, it doesn't matter what you learn about a profession, you're not going to be happy. Someone asked me, said, well, give me an example. I said, well, look, if you have a short attention span, the last thing you ought to do is be a professor, because no one can write a book, in 15 minutes. He said, oh, well, that's a good example. But so I think two takeaways: one, follow your passion; two, follow the advice that Albert and Nicole gave about how to develop mentors and so forth, and how to overcome these obstacles. But the other is make sure you know yourself, because it wouldn't have done Albert any good, if it turns out all he really was good at was being an engineer, then going into entertainment would have been a mistake, right, Albert? Right?
Yep.
So,
Right.
by the way, I'm assuming you're good at what you do, but
I hope I am. Sort of. Sometimes. On good days. And good days I am. But yeah.
So I want to end by, first of all, thanking the two panelists. Nicole, you did a good, cheap imitation of Richard Louis. I will tell him that you did well and that he got quoted at least 2 or 3 times. He'll feel good about that. And I also want to thank the audience for joining us in this series. We have a couple coming up. We have one on Asian American women in the law. That's on October 23rd. And then we have one which, Albert, really ties into what you were saying. We're going to have one in December that we're planning on how to market yourself, because Asian Americans are really not good at marketing. So we'll have people talk about how do you market yourself. So I hope you'll join us for some of those. And again, thank you very much, Nicole and Albert, for really a wonderful discussion this evening.
Thanks for having
Thank
us.
you.